Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm the Chair of Research and the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Eli Ratner. Dr. Ratner is currently a principal at the Marathon Initiative and a senior fellow at Clarion Strategies. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs from 2021 to 2025 and as Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden from 2015 to 2017. He also worked in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at the State Department and in the U.S. Senate as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Outside of government, Dr. Ratner has worked as the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security, a Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and as an Associate Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. He received his BA from Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs and earned his PhD in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Eli's talk today will explore some new work on the case for developing a new Asian alliance to counter China. As he writes, the time has come for the United States to build a collective defense pact in Asia. For decades, such a pact was neither possible nor necessary. But today, in the face of a growing threat from China, it is both viable and essential. American allies in the region are already investing in their own defenses and forging deeper military bonds. But without a robust commitment to collective defense, the Indo-Pacific is on a path to instability and conflict. Eli has recently written about this in a foreign affairs article, and I'll post that link to that article in the chat. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. He will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start by raising your hands electronically or typing questions into the chat while he is speaking. Thank you so much, Dr. Ratner, for joining us here today, and over to you.
Well, Rupal, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to CGSR for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your July summer to join for this discussion, and very much looking forward to the conversation part of the event today. So really wonderful to be here. The team asked me to talk a little bit about the article that I have in the current edition of Foreign Affairs that is called The Case for the Pacific Defense Pact. You know, when you're trained in government, you have to brief as absolutely as quickly as you can. So I don't know that I've spoken for 40 minutes at length in recent memory, but I'll do my best to provide as much detail, and then we can get into the conversation here. So the basic argument of the piece starts with the threat and the challenge, which continues to be the China challenge as described by the Biden administration in a number of strategy documents as the only country in the world with both the will and increasingly the capability to overturn the international order, the international system, in a way that would be quite detrimental to U.S. national interest. And we have a pretty good understanding of what that alternative vision is in Beijing and what it would look like from a security perspective. I know we have a very knowledgeable group of attendees on the line today, but as I think about it, Beijing is working to control the East Asian littoral militarily, to control the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea, to seize Taiwan, to break U.S. alliances, undermine their influence, and potentially drive the United States from power, and eventually to become the dominant power in the region and to govern over a China-led order in the Indo-Pacific that, again, would challenge U.S. future security and prosperity. So that's the threat as I perceive it. And in my view, the central task, or at least one of the central tasks in U.S. foreign policy, is to ensure, to try to prevent the PRC from using its military to achieve those ends. And that's why the Biden administration focused so much on deterrence. And that's really the name of the game here. So as we were talking about what's the purpose of the policy initiatives and the strategy that we're putting forward today. It really is about maintaining stability, maintaining free and open Indo-Pacific, and preventing truly destabilizing forms of aggression. So that's the bottom line motivation here. You heard during the Biden administration, the PRC talked about as the pacing challenge. We took a number of steps in response to that, including starting with the National Defense Strategy, the 22 National Defense Strategy, which was the first ever to describe the PRC as the principal challenge facing the United States. The 2018 NDS had shifted toward a focus toward great power competition from counterterrorism, but did not single out the PRC as the singular challenge in the way that the 22 NDS did. We produced defense budgets in response to that strategy that focused resources on capabilities designed to address operational challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We worked on a number of new operational concepts designed to challenge the way that the PRC was planning to fight against the United States through its anti-access and area denial capabilities, so to be able to operate in and around the Indo-Pacific in new ways. We started developing a more diversified force posture in the region. That's something that my office spent a huge amount of time on, trying to move the United States from a forward deployed posture in the Indo-Pacific that was very concentrated on Northeast Asia and Japan and South Korea to one that was much more distributed, much more resilient, mobile, and lethal. And we did that through Japan, the Philippines, Australia, Papua New Guinea, other places in the Western Pacific. So through major changes to force posture. And then the other important element of this deterrence equation, in addition to the capabilities and the concepts and the force posture, was our approach to our alliances and partnerships. This was obviously a major theme of the administration, and that was an important part of deterrence, which I'll get to in a little bit more detail. But when we brought all those pieces together, the capabilities, the concepts, the posture, the alliances, we believed that we had fortified deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. We described deterrence as real and strong. We said that our assessment was that conflict in the Indo-Pacific was neither imminent nor inevitable. But there was an important asterisk to that statement, which was that it was going to require heightened urgency and attention and resources across all of those lines, across capabilities and concepts and force posture in our alliances. It was going to require heightened attention, urgency, and resources to be able to maintain that deterrence into the future as the PLA was continuing very aggressively to modernize its capabilities, and certainly the will and the desire in Beijing to refashion the regional security order was unabated. So one of the things I was certainly thinking about well in office, but one of the drivers for writing this article was to think about, when we talk about needing more attention, more resources, more focus, thinking about how we need to evolve our strategy into the future to stay ahead of that deterrence curve as the PLA modernizes. What does that look like in the alliance context? What does that mean in the case of our alliances? And from the US perspective, the regional security order, how does it need to evolve in the face of this mounting challenge? And that, again, is very much at the core of this work. As folks know, our alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific, unlike Europe, is deeply predicated on bilateral relationships. We did a lot of work on those during the Biden administration, I think almost to a T. Over the last several years, they have been at a high watermark of their historical strength, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, our partnerships with Vietnam, India, and others. But the truly key innovation that occurred during the last administration, from my perspective, was to go from what had historically been the hub and spoke model of our alliances, with the United States at the middle and then the spokes of the individual alliances, to take that and start building what people described as a network, or a lattice work, or what Secretary Austin described as the new convergence in the Indo-Pacific, which in my perspective was, having been in the assistant secretary role, one of the really the most important, interesting, exciting evolutions and innovations in the regional security order that we had seen in quite some time. And certainly now, it was the kind of thing that analysts had been talking about for decades. I've been in and out of think tanks. You could go back 15, 20 years, and people were talking about the need to somehow try to bring our allies together, but it hadn't really started happening in a very meaningful way until the last few years. And the opportunities to be networking among our allies really exploded from one of aspiration to not just dialogue, but actually starting to begin to really engage in activities. And from a strategy perspective, from a US policy perspective, it was a really interesting time, because in some ways it was the dog catching the car, where folks had been writing about this for quite some time, thinking about it for quite some time, urging our allies and partners to do it for quite some time. And then all of a sudden, there was a huge amount of energy around this. And we had obviously the AUKUS agreement with Australia and the UK. We were starting to do more in the security and defense realm with what is referred to as the Indo-Pacific Quad, with India, Japan, and Australia. We had an unprecedented amount of cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea as well. We stood up a new configuration that we very informally called the Squad, the S for Southeast Asia Quad, but that was the United States, Japan, and the Philippines and Australia, and we were meeting regularly at the secretary level. We were starting to do a number of interesting activities together. So all of a sudden, the task and what we had to do inside the Pentagon was no longer try to convince people that we needed to be working with our allies and partners more, much less with the allies together, but rather looking out at what was starting to become opportunity that was outstripping bandwidth in terms of what we were going to be able to do with limited resources. And we were going to have to be selective about the ways in which we were doing this, the time in which we were spending at the political military levels as well. So a very interesting time, a very evolutionary time in the regional security environment. But I think transitional is how I would describe it, because as we were thinking about, okay, what is the preferred end state here in terms of these types of relationships, as important and historic as that transition was from the hub and spoke model to something complementary on top of it, of this kind of networking or minilateralism, the reality is that these arrangements are all in and of themselves incomplete and too informal for the kinds of combat credible deterrence that we were going to need into the future. And in this ad hoc way, where leaders were meeting on an ad hoc basis, staffs were meeting on an ad hoc basis, the militaries were cooperating, but not frequently enough. And some of the core functions that would be necessary for future combat credible deterrence were not being done at the level they needed to do, such as actual crisis and contingency planning, development of command and control, development of headquarters, conceptions of forward deployments and force posture in that integrated way. None of these things were happening at the level that one would need in the future to actually bring together the force and deterrence to bear of the collective, such that you have this phenomenon of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts that you would need to maintain deterrence into the future. So I became increasingly convinced over time that, again, as we were shepherding through this transitional period, that eventually it was going to be necessary to formalize these relationships to try to ensure that kind of long-term deterrence. And that got me to the argument that I put forward in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, the case for the Pacific Defense Pact. So what is the proposal that I put forward? And I'll talk about the details, but should also say, look, the purpose of writing something like this is not to have the final word on it and to say, okay, here's the idea, go run with it, but to generate a genuine debate in Washington, nationally, but of course in the region and in these capitals as well, to try to think through, okay, what is the best way to try to achieve what we're talking about here. But the proposal that I put forward for a new Pacific Defense Pact, a new collective defense agreement in the Indo-Pacific, was between four countries at the outset: the United States, Australia, Philippines, and Japan. So those are the core four that I started with. And the question I had to answer in the piece was not just, why is this necessary? Why do we need a more integrated combat credible deterrence? I think that's maybe the easier argument to make, but rather, why should we believe that this is possible now in a way that it hasn't been historically? There had been fits and starts of conversations about this dating all the way back to the post-Cold War period. Of course, we had SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which never really came to be anything remotely close to what we're describing here. So why should we believe that a Pacific, in this big region with a lot of different interests and a lot of different geography, why should we believe that a Pacific Defense Pact is viable now in a way that it wasn't in the past? And I think there are three principal reasons for that. The first is that we really have closer alignment with this core set of allies than we have ever had in recent times, in terms of the centrality of the primary threat, certainly in terms of the centrality of the China challenge. And each one of these governments in their own way, the United States, of course, with our own transition, as I was describing, from the global war on terror to one more focused on great power competition, down the line between Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. All three of those countries have gone through a transition where they are much more focused now, principally focused on China as their primary and common threat. Of course, in Japan, we've seen the Japanese slowly loosening the legal and political constraints on their self-defense forces. We've seen a pledge in Japan for them to double their defense budget. We've seen them acquiring or planning to acquire new capabilities such as offensive strike and taking on greater roles and missions in the region, principally because of the threat they feel from the PRC. Similarly, in the Philippines, a country there that was focused, if you were wound back a decade or more, their defense strategy, their acquisitions, their training, their focus, almost specifically entirely on internal security, their strategy, all of that has significantly evolved over the last decade as they've been feeling the pressure and coercion from the PRC. And we've seen the Philippines taking on a much more externally oriented national security and defense strategy and military modernization strategy as well, to reflect that prioritization of the external environment. And then, of course, in Australia, you have a country where a number of experts, defense strategists, conceived of the China threat as, again, back a decade ago or plus, as something that was more distant in time, also more distant in geography, to a new context today where new Australian strategy documents are saying we need to focus much more on the defense of Australia, not just far off stabilization operations. And we need to really think about the challenges of major power threats, obviously very much focused on China itself. And we've seen that in terms of the modernization priorities in Australia, in addition to their strategy documents. So you have this much closer alignment of common threat perception than we have had in the past. And I will say, again, a lot of folks on the line here who have regularly engaged with Asian allies. It was pretty incredible, having been working on these issues for the last couple of decades, to be in official meetings with partners, senior officials, and ministers from these countries, and have them articulating a perception of the regional security environment and the threat from the PRC that sounded almost exactly like the conception inside the Pentagon. So an unprecedented level of alignment, whereas in the past, even with our major allies, they probably would have distributed their threat perceptions a little too differently to be able to align them so closely than we can today. So that was the number one major trend that makes this different from the past. A second is that we have really seen an explosion of intra-Asian security cooperation. And it's worth noting that with a proposal like the Pacific Defense Pact, of course, the United States already has bilateral treaty alliances with these partners. From that perspective, the major innovation that would have to occur from a commitments perspective would be between the Asian allies themselves, because as folks know, in the Indo-Pacific, with the possible exception of the alliance between North Korea and China, which we can all debate about how real that is, the only actual mutual defense treaties in the region are between bilateral treaties with the United States. There are no intra-Asian mutual security defense treaties. So that would be the truly biggest innovation here. And that has been a major trend, again, of the last 5 to 10 years, where we've seen much deeper intra-Asian defense cooperation than we have in the past. You have experts in Australia and Japan, and frankly, sometimes officials in private, describing the Australia-Japan relationship as alliance-like. Australia and Japan recently concluded a reciprocal access agreement, which allows their forces to operate in each other's countries in ways that hasn't been possible before. Just in the last year and a half or so of the last administration, we saw, just for instance, F-35s, Japanese F-35s going to Australia for the first time, Australian F-35s going to Japan for the first time. So much greater cooperation and integration between these militaries. And the Philippines has been a part of that story as well in terms of their defense relationship with Japan. They're also in the process of concluding a reciprocal access agreement, and just a burgeoning of regional security integration among the partners. And this four in particular, between Australia, Philippines, Japan, then with the United States, from my perspective, had already created a pretty significant foundation that could be built upon, whether it were things that were happening in a U.S. Bilateral context with allies in which other allies were starting to join, or initial trilateral arrangements, or even initiatives that were born in that quadrilateral setting, whether it was in the form of maritime domain awareness, whether it was in the form of new command and control arrangements, some of the force posture agreements that I described, just a lot of fodder to be building upon here between these four countries. So really the intra-Asia piece being a key part of the story here. And then the third piece would be what I would describe as the new reciprocity, which is simply that, or the demand for a new reciprocity, which is simply that The asymmetries, the imbalances in U.S. alliances in the region were just, I think this is evident to say at this point, but increasingly unsustainable from either a political or a strategic perspective, that it just was going to be required for combat credible deterrence, but also for political sustainability for our allies to start taking a bigger role in the region, whether that's through roles and missions in crisis and contingencies, whether that's through contributions and defense spending. And it's my view that as we've been talking about, and this was something that obviously has been a huge focus of the Trump administration, but it certainly started earlier than that in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific, having conversations with allies about, okay, what more can you do now that you are modernizing a way where you can really contribute to deterrence and crises and contingencies. I think it's my view, looking at this problem today, that the Trump administration has been almost singularly focused on this question of defense spending, and that the actual conversation about a more mutual, more reciprocal relationship is a much broader conversation. And we really need to widen the aperture to be thinking about not just how much our allies spending, but what roles and missions are they taking on? How are they thinking about access basing and overflight? How are they thinking about force posture? How are they thinking about mutual commitments to one another? But a lot of these conversations with Japan, with Australia, with the Philippines, are all underway. And those are the kinds of conversations that would further facilitate and create a context for something like a Pacific Defense Pact in a way that wouldn't have made sense with a legacy construct of alliances when it was very much the United States bearing the principal burden in these relationships. So I see all of these trends coming together: the alignment, the intra-Asian cooperation, and the demand for a new reciprocity that makes a Pacific Defense Pact viable today in a way that just wasn't the case in the past. So that's the argument for. Let me just add a couple, just address a couple other points, having had a number of conversations, obviously, in the development of these ideas, but since the publication of the article, I have a sense of where folks' questions are, and I'll try to address some of them up front, though, of course, would be lots of additional opportunities for good comments and inputs. The first is on the question of membership, which is, why did you think about just these 4 countries? What about other countries? Did you consider this country? Did you consider that country? I think I just explained why I thought particularly those 4 countries were well suited to start with. But clearly, from my perspective, historically, the problem has been that when people conceived of some kind of pan-regional organization, or if it was too broad in terms of membership, you would lose that alignment, you would lose that focus, you would lose that sense of purpose. And so to do something like this, you really do need to be selective. So it is very much about starting with the countries who are most aligned, but from my perspective, again, thinking of it as an open architecture. So I don't think it would be realistic to do something like this out of the gate with India or Southeast Asians and South Korea and New Zealand and every country in the Indo-Pacific, include European partners who operate in and out of the region. I think it's important to be more selective than that. So I've described why I think the 4 countries, the core 4 initial, are the right ones. But certainly there would be others worth considering. The South Korea, the ROK, is one that I think is always atop people's minds. And from my perspective, the door should absolutely be open to South Korea, and that would be a decision for leaders in Seoul. The challenges to date, South Korea has been almost principally focused on North Korea, and they would have to be quite willing to change their overall defense and military strategy to participate in something like a Pacific Defense Pact. It would mean them being more oriented toward China in their defense strategy. It would mean being more willing to cooperate and integrate with Japan. That's been something that they have been taking baby steps on, or bigger than baby steps, over the last several years. But what we're talking about here would be quite more significant than that. And they would have to be willing to be orienting their defense strategy much more off the peninsula and throughout the region in a way that's different from what we've seen in the past. Those are all things that I think are possible, and they're things that we have been pushing and asking the South Koreans to do for quite some time, but we haven't seen really significant evolutions in that regard. But certainly, again, the door would remain open. Same for New Zealand as a country who I think would be welcome, but would have to change their strategic orientation toward being willing to be bound back into some kind of treaty relationship. India is another country that often is raised as a potential. I think the U.S.-India defense relationship couldn't be more important. India's role in regional security couldn't be more important. But from my perspective, they still maintain a 360 orientation in their defense and national security strategy, a view toward multipolarity, a part of their identity in the global South, such that they may not be willing at this moment to sign into something like this. Though, again, the door should always remain open. So happy to talk about other countries or opportunities, but this is the core four that felt to me like ready to go now. And if we waited for perfect alignment among the breadth of U.S. allies and partners throughout the region, something like this would just never come together. Often asked about, well, what about the reaction in the region? How are partners in the region going to respond? How would you manage that? I think one answer to that is, look, it depends how you describe something like this. Staying focused on the affirmative agenda of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is an aspiration that is shared by almost everybody in the Indo-Pacific, including countries throughout Southeast Asia. So being clear, describing this is about maintaining openness, it's about maintaining peace and stability would be important. And then reinforcing the point that something like this is not the organization to end all organizations in the region, that we would continue to view the multiplicity of organizations and arrangements in the region as complementary and overlapping. This Pacific Defense Pact would not seek to displace them, nor would it seek to take on the breadth of foreign policy or economic issues that are managed through other institutions. This would be principally a defense and security organization, and not going broader than that. Two more just to put on the table here, and then I'll wind this down. The third being, well, what about the reaction from the PRC? Aren't you worried that this will be a self-fulfilling prophecy and lead to instability? There's, of course, the Russian arguments that NATO is to blame for the Ukraine invasion. Would we see something like that? My response to that is, yes, it is true that the PRC would likely react very badly to the establishment of an institution like this. But that is principally because it is what is required to deter and prevent their revisionist aims. So, of course, they're going to object to something like this because they would see it as an obstacle to them being able to use aggression effectively to achieve their foreign policy and national aspirations. So I don't take their negative reaction as a problem not to do it. I see it as, in some ways, validation that it would serve the precise function for which it would be designed. But yes, of course, we would need to be prepared for the kind of coercion that the PRC would exact upon the other three partners, and we have some experience with that, but one would expect economic and political and cyber and informational attacks and operations against these three countries to prevent them from doing it, and then or in retaliation if they do decide to do so. I think just on this China question, the last thing I would say about this is, um, it depends a little bit on what you think the alternative is, because it's always easy to criticize a policy recommendation, but you got to look at um, the costs or the implications of not doing something as well. And in this case, from my perspective, keeping these arrangements as they exist today in an unofficial, informal capacity that never gets to the actual depth of military cooperation necessary for combat credible deterrence is a path to instability and PRC aggression, and failing to take this step ultimately would be more destabilizing than taking it. So we ought to be willing to accept some degree of tension and discomfort for the purposes of achieving deterrence. Finally, just on the point of timing and what about the Trump administration here, who hasn't necessarily led with allies as the principal arm of its national security strategy and foreign policy. Just a few points here. I mean, the first would be, again, reminder that the principal innovation here from a mutual defense perspective is about commitments among and between the intra-Asian allies themselves. There are not new obligations here for the United States. Second, and this I think may be changing over time depending on the direction of U.S. policy in the coming months, but defense establishments have been to a degree able to silo defense and military cooperation and allow that cooperation to go forward even amid some of these very strong political and economic headwinds. So I don't think that the tariffs per se or some of the other political challenges have completely undermined the momentum and the defense cooperation that is ongoing every day out in the region between the United States and its allies. Now, I do think the political will for moving forward with something like this, like a Pacific Defense Pact, probably is not in place right now. I would recognize that. But the actual defense cooperation in many instances does continue to move forward. And I think that's one of the points here, which is that even as there are these kind of political and economic headwinds, our defense and military establishments can continue to lay the foundations for this kind of cooperation in our command and control initiatives, in our maritime domain awareness initiatives, in our planning efforts, in our force posture efforts. We can continue moving forward, always with the question in mind of, are we ensuring that we are doing this in a way, designing these institutions and initiatives in a way such that we can integrate partners when we want to. And frankly, the number of tasks required to actually build an institution like this would likely extend beyond the next couple years of the Trump administration anyway. So I see this as a big opportunity for the next team, potentially the next administration. So why don't I start there? Thank you for listening, and look forward to getting into a discussion.